For this lesson, we need to look at the data. How does the data align with those factors? From a story perspective, does it fulfill the stakeholders' goals? Does it meet the needs of the user? Lots of patterns emerge when looking at data, but not all of those patterns reflect meaningful narratives. After this lesson, you will be able to recognize your predisposition to seeing narratives of all kinds and decide what to pursue. We don't want to get lost in the data, so let's get started.
Hello again. Along with getting to know the stakeholders' objectives and the audience's needs, it's important to familiarize yourself with the data that you'll be using for your stories. I believe one of the best things about Tableau is that it is easy to rapidly import and visualize data, so you can evaluate, explore, test, and sketch different possibilities for approaching a story fairly easily. Now, here are some sample questions to consider about your data at the outset of your project. What types of data are going to be used? What is the quality and completeness of the data? What are potentially the most relevant dimensions of the data set for your story? How fresh is the data? How frequently is it updated? In terms of your story, how will that data be framed, potentially? And what kinds of actions or decisions might arise from the data story that you are going to be telling? In previous lessons, we considered the idea of expressiveness and effectiveness. That is all the data needed to accurately express the story included, and is the presentation style effectively conveying the meaning in the data? Clearly, a problem with either expressiveness or effectiveness could hurt your data story. When working to find the story in the first place, how do you decide which elements of your data are relevant and which are not? Then, when it comes to the final presentation of the story, you may have to decide again which details to include and which to leave out. A data set may contain many different interesting potential stories, but unless you ask the right questions at the outset, some of those stories may not immediately reveal themselves. On the other hand, some stories seem to jump out from patterns in the data, but not all of them will prove to be accurate. Some, in fact, can lead to incorrect conclusions and bad decisions. As we have learned earlier, people can readily devise false narratives from patterns in data. The larger and more complex the data set is, the more chance false narratives can emerge, as well as the temptation to turn them into stories. A line from the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes offers some real-world wisdom about this. "My dear Watson," he says, "how dangerous it is to reason from insufficient data." Let's look at some examples of how insufficient data mixed with unconscious bias can distort a story and how we might be able to fix it. Let's look at some examples of how insufficient data mixed in with a little unconscious bias and emotion can sometimes distort a story and how that might be fixed. The first scenario involves accurately understanding the meaning of a medical test result. In general, people can have a hard time thinking in terms of probabilities or the meaning of a test, especially because of the backdrop of emotional charge behind it. There can be hidden biases and incomplete data that may make the story even more difficult to interpret. In this case, Nancy receives some worrisome news from her doctor, a positive mammogram. Based on this result, what is the physician going to tell Nancy about the likelihood that she does in fact have cancer? Unfortunately, the doctor is recalling only part of some data from a study she once saw about cancer rates in positive mammograms. The positive result from Nancy's mammogram has nudged the doctor into unwittingly thinking about her only in the left-hand column, which says has breast cancer, and forgetting about the data in the right column, which says doesn't have breast cancer. That means the conclusion the doctor arrives at and presents to her patient are going to be wrong. However, by simply diagramming out the table and the contents within it, we can make it easier for Nancy and for her physician to get a significantly more accurate idea of the chances of her having cancer. The key is to make sure of showing all the data necessary for the story and presenting it in the simplest way possible. Now, by looking at this diagram, you can see the real probability is more like 8% rather than 80%. It might seem strange to you that the number is so low. Does that mean the test is bad? Well, no. Mammograms are highly sensitive so that they can pick up abnormalities of various kinds, but are not as good at being specific about what those abnormalities are. This might be also useful detail for Nancy to understand the meaning of her result. Now, let's look at that story again with the 3 C's and a more complete idea and interpretation of the data. Context. Nancy has a positive mammogram. Challenge. Determining what the results mean for her chances of actually having cancer. Conclusion. Because the test is very sensitive but not very specific, the chances of cancer are closer to 8% rather than the originally guessed at by her physicians 80%. The moral of this little narrative is that a good story requires doing some homework and developing an awareness of potential biases in ourselves and others. Also, adding in some key details that shed light on the reasons or the why for the results can be very helpful as well for context. Let's look at another example. In World War II, Allied aircraft were being shot out of the sky at an alarming rate. One way to stanch the losses was to add more protective armor to the planes. But there's a catch. The armor couldn't just go anywhere because it adds weight, which is not great for performance and fuel consumption of the plane. The best locations for armor had to be carefully selected. Now, looking for repeating patterns of damage in the planes that return from the mission might suggest exactly where to put that armor, right? Well, let's map out the story. Context. Allied planes are being shot down at an alarming rate. Challenge. Because the more armor we add for protection, the heavier planes become, we need to be highly selective on where to put it. We'll use recurring patterns of damage on the returning planes to determine where to add that extra armor. Conclusion. We've added more armor to the areas of the plane that appear to regularly sustain the most damage. Problem solved, right? Well, maybe not. Can you tell why? All the returning planes that sustained damage did, by definition, survive without extra armor. The more useful patterns of damage would be on the planes that did not return. However, they are out of sight, out of mind, and that data may never be collectible anyway. This is sometimes called survivor bias, and it can be mitigated by being aware of it in the first place, and also potentially showing the data in a way that helps the audience recognize and reframe the issue with a full set of necessary considerations, even if some of it is missing in action. Here's another version of the story. Context. Allied planes are being shot down at an alarming rate. Challenge. Because the more armor we add for protection, the heavier the planes become, we need to be highly selective about placement. We examined the patterns of damage sustained by the returning planes and considered potential areas where the damage would not be survivable. Conclusion. Based on a range of considerations from the planes that returned and those that did not, we added more armor to the areas of the plane that are most vulnerable. Often, all the data that's needed to tell a complete story or provide the full context may not be available at the outset of a project. Finding the true story is a process of weighing and evaluating available evidence and working to fill in any gaps as well as you possibly can. Any piece of evidence does not exist in isolation. It should be considered in context, but that context can sometimes change. The relative meaning and significance of any piece of data may shift as other available information comes in. A piece of evidence may be true but irrelevant or potentially misleading if not kept in context. Consider the case of a boy who has a fever and a rash from an unknown cause. Now, this example is adapted from a study in the Journal of Contemporary Pediatrics. The context of the story is a child who has a set of symptoms that could be caused by many potential illnesses. In this case, it's fever and a rash. The challenge is to sift through the data and see what's meaningful and what is not in terms of the cause of this child's symptoms. Drawing a conclusion is not possible yet. However, here's some detailed data from the journal article. For our purposes right now, the important point is not that there are a lot of facts, but there is a much smaller set of relevant facts hiding among this large set of data. We don't know just yet what those facts are, so we cannot tell the full story. I'm going to show some of the data to you about this case, not for you to look at it in any great detail, but to recognize that at the start of finding a story in data, there are many details, some of which seem relevant and others not, but that none of the bits of evidence at this point are clear in terms of how crucial they are. And there may be some things that seem extraneous but turn out to be absolutely vital to the final data story. Here's the first line of the case. A previously healthy 12-year-old boy presents to an emergency department in southern Ohio in October with a chief complaint of fever and rash. We then learn there are these additional facts. Further questioning reveals the patient traveled to southern Kentucky for about 4 weeks for a Labor Day camping trip with his family. He recalls having found ticks in his clothing but not his skin. He denies alcohol or drug use. He reports that he has a girlfriend but denies any sexual activity. The family has numerous pets, including 1 hermit crab, 1 African clawed frog, 2 lizards, 1 domestic white rat, 1 python, and a tank of tropical fish. They had 2 dogs, but both recently died of unknown causes. The patient denies any animal bites. Now, you don't know the conclusions of the story yet, but I do. I can tell you that some of what I thought seemed meaningless data was actually crucial. Some of the things that I read to you are very important, some are not important, and some are flat out untrue. But this is not clear from the original data set that we've been given. Making the situation even more challenging is that there is a large number of possible diagnoses, of which only one will be the correct conclusion to this story. Now, with the help of exploratory sketches of the data and ongoing collection of more data that we need, can help eliminate the irrelevant findings. In this sketch, the initial conditions are entered in the left, and on the right you see the possibilities from which those more likely pathways to the correct answer. Now the full story can be told and it becomes clear what data is and isn't relevant. The diagnosis turns out to be a fairly rare illness of rat bite fever. So let's do our 3 C's. The boy has a fever, rash, and rash due to unknown causes. The challenge is finding the right diagnosis when there are many possible causes and outcomes. The conclusion is, it turns out the boy's pet rat bit him and transmitted the infection. It also likely caused the boy's 2 dogs to die from the same cause. So recapping, what can we learn from this example of an investigation and a final story? Well, several things. All the necessary data may not be available at the start to tell a true story. Some of the data that may initially seem irrelevant can actually be essential, and other data that may seem true, such as the patient denies any animal bites, may not prove to be true for various reasons. But that can often only be determined by iteratively assessing and weighing the data against various other factors and other data. Being able to see different possibilities and pathways based on the best available data at the time can help think through the analytic process and to arrive at a correct conclusion.